Apostles, by their very nature, are vile and disgusting beings. They sacrifice the people closest to them to gain their powers, and in most cases, they do it to escape the suffering of their former lives. These escapists then go on to live lives of death, consumption, and destruction. They kill because they feel like killing, destroy whatever tries to stop them from killing, and more often than not, will turn their kills into a fresh meal. But even amongst such abhorrent creatures, there are apostles that stand out for their cruelty, and one of the prime examples of such a creature is Wyald. This ape-like apostle is one of the most disturbing characters in all of Berserk, period. And in this video, we'll be breaking down how his anatomy is the basis for all of it. Who was Wyald? How did he become an apostle? As you guys might know, thanks to our Zod anatomy video, which you should totally check out if you haven't yet, apostles gain their current existential forms based on the desires they had in their previous lives. Wyald was captured as a criminal in his current life, so you'd think that that's what he was before too, right? Well, not quite. Mild spoilers for later on in the video, but upon Wyald's death, the Band of the Falcon has a shocking realization. The beast they had been fighting for so long was nothing more than a decrepit old man. Usually, when an apostle dies, their bodies revert to the form they were in before making the reincarnation sealing sacrifice. The Slug Count, who was the last apostle we'd seen die in the series, looked pretty much the same as his apostle base form even in his previous life, though he was far trimmer, we must say. Rosine, an apostle we see die later on in the series, ascended when she was a child, so when she dies, she returns to her original state, that of a fearful pre-teenager. Wyald, on the other hand, went from looking like a prime UFC fighter in base to a prime UFC fighter's deceased great-grandfather post-death. This tells us two things about him. Number one, he probably waited on becoming an apostle for a very long time, or found his Behelit very late in life, and number two, he was nothing like his apostle self back when he was a human. And yeah, sure, decrepit old men are usually the ones that turn out to be lecherous. We're not going to deny that somewhat accurate stat, but hear us out on this one. To become an apostle, sacrifices are needed. And more than that, the desire to reach out for the power that awaits you should be as strong as your desire to live. Most apostles agreed to reincarnate themselves because they felt powerless in life, and it's very likely that this was the case for Wyald as well. An old man, tired of serving others though he loves them, living for everyone but himself. Wyald must have truly hated the lifestyle he had as a human, because his motto as an apostle is to enjoy and excite. We'll get to what he means by that in just a bit, so stay tuned, but at some point, his dam of patience must have broken, and he ended up using his Behelit to sacrifice the life he lived for others in favor of a life he lived for himself. Or maybe his frustration with being a family man against his wishes boiled over. Perhaps he was on his deathbed as a closeted lecher and only realized he wanted all he had ignored, and that fueled his decision making. Or maybe he had just bought his Behelit in the late 70s from an exotic salesman in an eastern bazaar. Whatever the case, this decrepit old man used that internal motivation to activate his Behelit and created for himself a lifestyle that reflected his dreams, but was a nightmare for everyone else involved. Why is Wyald the prime example of an apostle? What happened after he ascended? Now that you know our thoughts on why Wyald became an apostle, let's talk about what happened when he became one. People who have been rocking with us since day one know that when a human destined to become an apostle activates their Behelit, a fissure opens up in their hearts, which links them to the abyss. Should they accept the God Hand's offer of power in exchange for a sacrifice and a hidden serve until death clause, that fissure will allow the power of evil to surge through the chosen one's body and transform them into an apostle. All demonic creatures in Berserk have physical forms that align with their deep desire for power. You could even call these forms a reflection of the ideal versions they've created of themselves within their own heads, minus all the characteristics that make them a proper human being. Locust and Grunbeld look pretty much the same in their base forms as they did in their human lives, for example. Their apostle forms reflect their self-images, a jousting legend who becomes a knightly centaur, and a one-man army that becomes a corundum-skinned fire dragon, respectively. They were warriors who died at the peak of their physical strength, and so their base forms didn't need much changing. Wyald, on the other hand, ascended as an old man. He had lived a long life that had been harsh on his body, and he wanted to experience the rigors of a youthful life. This is where his motto becomes relevant: enjoy and excite. Two fairly innocent words that take on a dark hue when they come out of Wyald's mouth. For a guy that spent most of his life powerless and helpless, Wyald's idea of excitement and enjoyment was very different. He found things he couldn't physically do anymore to be exhilarating as all hell, so once he became connected to hell, he received received a body that would allow him to fulfill his ugliest wants to his heart's desire. Wyald was resurrected as a towering physical specimen that looked more ape than human even in his base form. This is because his rebirth reflects his most primal desires and gives him a form that can fully experience those desires without any inhibitions. His primal look is disturbingly fitted for his primal way of life, because when Wyald isn't killing people, he could be found slaking his lust on dozens of women. In fact, that's how he's introduced to the series, sitting in the middle of a sea of exhausted women as the only active person in the room. That's why we call Wyald the prime example of an apostle. The existence of an apostle is an inherent abomination. They're born out of hatred and exist solely for the purpose of terrorizing humans and serving the God Hand. Apostles commit every taboo act imaginable, and they do it with such glee that you'd think you're abnormal for not partaking. Wyald is the true embodiment of an apostle's nature. He doesn't care about anything or anyone beyond himself. All he wants is a good fight and a better lay, consenting or otherwise. He'll do absolutely everything he can to satisfy his baser needs, and that's what apostles are all about in Berserk. With the exception of guys like Zod, Grunbeld, Locus, and Irvine, we've not seen a single apostle that would refuse the offer of bloodshed and slaughter. They'd violate dead bodies if they wanted to, and eat the corpse after for dessert. Wyald ended up exciting and enjoying himself all the way to Midland's prison, which must have been a setup as well considering his outrageous strength. How powerful is Wyald in his base form? Is he a trained fighter? Wyald landed on the King of Midland's radar and was made leader of the Black Dog Knights precisely because of his insane strength, even in his base form. 5 years before the Golden Age arc's proper timeline, Wyald was brought to the king, alongside many other able-bodied criminals for inspection. This was a time where Midland was on the losing end of the 100-Year War, and the king hadn't hitched his hopes to Griffith's band just yet. He wanted to put up the most nightmarish defense possible to Tudor's ceaseless attacks, and his decision was to let criminals perform his dirty deeds for him. Makes sense considering they would go to places and do things regular knights just wouldn't. And even then, the king was skeptical about making Wyald their leader because of his aura. Despite being a human being, even the King of Midland was able to sense the malignant bloodlust spilling forth from Wyald's apostle body. So, when the criminal suggested that he be named leader of this new unit, the king took him up on his suggestion just to see what he was working with. As Wyald expected, another criminal challenged his authority because, in their world, strength did the real talking, not words. The man, whose name was Barbo, was at least twice Wyald's size in length and width, and he had another advantage during their clash. Barbo chose to wield a weapon, where Wyald rejected one. In fact, the ape apostle didn't even get his bonds removed, claiming that it would be more fun doing things while restricted, and noting he needed to do something unique to make the other criminals fall in line. He declared that he would crown a tower in the king's courtyard with a new statue in honor of his appointment. Turns out that statue was Barbo, whom Wyald smacked so hard his body was impaled on the top of a tower at least 3 to 4 stories high. His movement was so quick that no one really saw what happened, but everyone knew all the same, especially the criminals. The king gave Wyald charge of the unit without further questions because A, he had earned it with that display of strength, and B, he was afraid of what would happen if he didn't. The leader of the Black Dog Knights had a win-loss record that matched Griffith's during the 100-Year War, but the reason his squad was never seen on the front lines is because of the methods they used to achieve those victories. Rape and dismemberment of the elderly and young were common exploits of the Black Dogs, and if you think that that was just a bunch of rogue criminals going wild, no sir, it wasn't. Wyald himself was the ringleader in that regard, and his men followed his example not out of a sense of loyalty, but out of pure, unadulterated fear. The Black Dog Knights were given a basic creed by their leader to enjoy and excite, to make things stimulating and interesting by doing absolutely everything Wyald expected them to do. If they tried to rebel, he simply pinched their heads into a bloody pulp, irrespective of whether they wore head armor or not. This relates to what we said earlier about Wyald basically getting a second chance to live a full life as an apostle and not wanting anyone, even his own soldiers, to sully the new creed he lives by. When one of his soldiers points out that pursuing the Band of the Falcon was basically a suicide mission for them, Wyald responds by saying that they think too much about living and dying when they should just focus on the here and now. It's a sickening way to look at things when you know the kind of acts he's trying to justify by saying that, but there is a personal element to it, we feel. This is why his men follow his commands even at the risk of death, because they know firsthand that Wyald can be worse than any enemy they face on the battlefield. Even against two guys as strong as Guts and Pippin, Wyald only gets excited by the prospect of facing them, unlike his men who keep dying. Being an apostle, Wyald's baseline strength is far superior to a human's, but we have a feeling that even amongst apostles, he's quite the anomaly. Wyald has no formal combat training. He has likely never done sword training, and he doesn't even fight using conventional weapons. Wyald fights with a wooden club, like a barbarian from the Stone Age or something. But what he lacks in technique, he more than makes up for with his laser-sharp reflexes punches and his absurd raw strength. The Black Dog Knight is an extremely durable individual. He withstood multiple explosions and leapt through walls of flames unharmed in his pursuit of the Band of the Falcon. He was able to smash a boulder coming for his head with a single punch, and he killed Guts' horse with a single throw of his wooden club. Actually, it wouldn't be accurate to call it a club, it was kinda just a big club he kept for offensive reasons. And speaking of logs, Wyald was strong enough to punch massive trees over with his bare fists. When he fought Guts, he was able to keep up with his movement on par with the other great fighters from the series like General Boskon and Zod. What's impressive about Wyald's feat though is that he did it off of instinct alone. Casca was shocked to see him managing Guts' lethal and rapid-fire strikes with such ease, but Guts was the one who truly understood how dire a situation they were in. Not only did he sense that Wyald was an apostle, like Zod, he also knew that this guy was running off of pure reflexes in their exchange. These things irked him, yes, but what bothered him the most was the fact that Wyald just straight up stopped Guts' sword mid-swing by catching his hand and bringing it to a halt. That bothered him a lot, as you can see from the manga panels. It took the Band of the Falcon's counterattack for Guts and Co. to isolate Wyald from his men, because he himself could keep up with the whole lot of them. It was only when the Falcon started routing his men that Wyald turned on them, dropping tree trunks on them like seeds and chastising them for not sharing his positive perspective on life. Wyald was happy to have finally met the man his fellow apostle Zod had praised as a worthy adversary, and now he wanted to have himself a little snack before the eclipse. Seeing his men turn on him only made him angrier, and he stopped caring about what form he was fighting in. Guts had picked up on his true nature anyway, so it would only be advantageous for Wyald to reveal his ace in the hole. And to absolutely no one's surprise, Wyald's released form is even stronger than his boulder-smashing base form. What makes Wyald the most disturbing apostle of Berserk? Without transforming, Wyald feels like the stuff of nightmares. An undying Neanderthal-looking fella that can club you to death in the blink of an eye if he feels like it. When he transforms, Wyald becomes a nightmare. In his release state, Wyald takes on the appearance of a giant monster ape, which is at least 5 times Guts' height. Wyald is as tall as some of the trees in the forest these guys are fighting in, and considering those trees can get pretty high, you can imagine how tall of a beast this guy is. And he was a beast, don't doubt it, dear viewers, because if Wyald looked like an ape before, in his release state, he resembles King Kong. Wyald's body takes the shape and form of a giant gorilla-like demon, with several disturbing features. His original upper body becomes the head and shoulders of his release state. The rest of it is designed in such a way that Wyald looks like he's got 2 faces, with the second one being the more monstrous of the 2. On his shoulders, he had 2 eyes, and on his chest, he spawned a 3rd vertical eye, underneath which, where his belly should have been, was a second mouth. Wyald's second mouth was big enough to crunch an entire horse and its rider to death, which is what he soon does after transforming. In this state, Wyald becomes even stronger than his base state, being able to uproot trees with a single arm and use them to kill dozens of people in single strikes. We've already mentioned how he treats cavalry in this form, so no need to go over that grisly scene again. Wyald is also deceptively agile in this state, as he is able to jump several times higher than his own height. And considering the fact that he could crush a person's skull with his fingers in his base form, you don't need us to tell you how he treated humans in his release state. Just take a look at this picture of Guts being thrown into the treether like a goddamn baseball. Yeah, not even Zod manhandled him like that. But what makes him the most disturbing apostle in Berserk isn't his beast-like strength. There are plenty others in the series that are far stronger than him, many of them apostles. What makes him disturbing is his mindset, and how he manages to use his apostle form to abuse his victims beyond torturing them to death. Baser apostles like Wyald are motivated by 2 things: bloodlust and actual lust. Satisfying the former is easy for them, but the latter, they have to come up with creative ways of implementation, shall we say. Wyald's was turning his second mouth's tongue into a disgusting penile nightmare of an appendage. Apparently, his actual penis wasn't going to be functional in his released form, so this absolute monstrosity is what he came up with as an alternative. You can tell this was designed with a specific intent to hurt the person it was used upon because of all the spikes covering it. Had he actually managed to assault Casca with it, she would have been reduced to a childlike state before the eclipse even happened. Luckily, she had slapped Guts around enough to wake him up from the stunned state and allowed him to chop off Wyald's tongue. Even after targeting a sensitive region like that, Guts' fight with Wyald was a very lopsided affair, as the apostle was just too damn resilient. Guts stabbed his stomach eye out and chopped him up in a bunch of different places, including crucial points like his knees, his chest, his palms, and his shoulders. But none of it slowed him down too much. It hurt him, don't get us wrong, but Wyald was still moving perfectly fine even as he was bleeding out. Guts, on the other hand, had a bunch of broken bones in his body thanks to being tossed around like a rag doll through a forest. This soon-to-be black swordsman did show off some impressive moves against his enemy, tanking a hellacious blow from a tree trunk of all things, but a straight-up battle was not going to end well for him. Guts already had the terrain advantage and he was still losing. Being the middle of a forest dense with foliage meant Wyald's moves would be restricted. He would have to remove obstacles or crush through them to go at his targets, and that could end up creating a vital opening. Instead, Wyald was making the forest work for him, treating his enemies like a game of 3D pinball. It took a big brain ploy from Guts for him to be finally able to put down his first apostle, and in the process, he ended up revealing a big secret about their anatomies, though he was unaware of it at the time. How Wyald's death revealed the truth about apostle anatomies. If you guys have only seen Berserk in animated formats, then you might not be aware of this little detail about apostles, considering it wasn't shown in either anime. When an apostle dies, their souls are dragged into the abyss, but this doesn't just happen if that apostle is within the spirit realm, as with the slug count. It happens to every apostle right after their death, and this is a shocking revelation for multiple reasons. The Black Swordsman arc is crucial to understanding some of the key concepts about apostles, the God Hand, and the inner workings of their rituals in general. It explains to us how the brand of sacrifice works, what apostles are, why they exist, and what a behelit is. There's a lot of lore that has been left out of the anime, and they're worse off for it in our opinion. The Abyss is one of the central locations in the Berserkverse, responsible for housing its key puppeteer, the idea of evil. It is also where the souls of every person to have ever gotten involved in a demonic ritual end up, in an endless swirling mass that's called the Vortex of Souls. It's this mass of spiritual entities that seems to both empower apostles in their reincarnated lives and then serve as their eternal tombs after its end. The Slug Count's death left some questions surrounding this factor, given that he was once one of the rare apostles chosen for a double ascension and died within the interstice. But Wyald's death put those questions to rest. It's also the first time Guts gets a glimpse of the Abyss canonically speaking, so that's pretty important too. But apart from explaining what happens to an apostle when they die, Wyald's death also explains how an apostle can avoid it. Sort of, anyways. After Guts stabs his head multiple times and sticks his broken sword through it, Wyald plays possum so he can grab hold of Griffith. The ape apostle might be a self-obsessed sadist, but when it comes to survival, he's like every other common rat. He instinctively reaches out for Griffith because he knows that Griffith possesses a behelit, which he plans to use to help himself out. When he realizes Griffith doesn't have the behelit, he decides to kill him, but just then, Zod shows up and impales Wyald on his horns. The apostle is shocked that a fellow apostle would do this to him, but despite his long life, Wyald clearly didn't figure out the Immortal One's playbook. Wyald is one of the oldest apostles in the series besides Zod. While most others were created within the last half century or so, and we say this just based off of intuition, Wyald claims to have been an apostle for a century. It is possible that Wyald was the one who last gave Zod a fight to remember, because the Immortal One claims that no human had pushed him as far as Guts had in 100 years during their first encounter, so the timeline would fit. But then Wyald would also know that Zod isn't above killing apostles to test his own strength, and that his allegiance lies solely with his pursuit of strength and with the God Hand's wishes. Wyald tried to kill a man destined to become a God Hand member. He probably thought that Griffith's behelit would help him reincarnate again, but he clearly didn't understand how behelits worked. If Wyald was destined to be saved, he would have had his own behelit, like the Slug Count did. Moreover, he thought that the God Hand would just save him as a favor when he tried to kill the man chosen to become a part of their ranks. We know that's a pipe dream from the Black Swordsman arc as well, because the God Hand, Griffith to be precise, plainly declared apostles to be their inconsequential servants. Wyald had also misunderstood the maxim handed to him by his masters because, as we mentioned at the beginning of this video, apostles have a hidden serve the God Hand at all costs cause buried within their reincarnation contracts. Just because he was told to do as he pleases, he thought he could overstate his mandate. Zod shut that down real quick and tore Wyald in half before telling Griffith his behelit would return to him eventually. After a few moments, Wyald's innards exploded and his soul was dragged into the abyss by countless damned spirits through a metaphysical fissure. When they were gone, Guts and the rest of the Falcons were shocked to see Wyald's true form, that of a tiny, withered old man. His death became as much of a relief for them as it did a mystery. But for us viewers, it answered many questions about apostle anatomy. For starters, all apostles' strengths and their very existences are conditional. They receive powers relevant to the strength of their desires and its emotional depth. People with complex emotions and deep conflicting philosophies and worldviews, like Griffith, end up becoming God Hands. People with soul-shaping ideals and an unending pursuit of them end up like Zod and Ganishka. People operating off a base sense of survival are the ones that end up like Wyald, and are granted features appropriate to act upon said base desires. Weird appendages, multiple faces, you know, the Kentaro Miura art style for apostles. While apostles are free to do whatever they please in general, if they make a move that hinders the God Hand's plans, they will be terminated on sight, because the true maxim handed down to them is, do as thou will, as long as it is guided by our hand. Interfering with the God Hand's machinations earns apostles a one-way ticket to the abyss, which they can avoid by simply staying alive and keeping to themselves in the physical world. Also, once an apostle has died, no matter where they are in the world, their souls will end up within that endless vortex. So the only escape for them, ironically enough, is to stay alive. And considering they're on the radar of not one but two demon hunters starting the past half-decade, it might as well be a cursed existence. Marvelous verdict! And that's all we've got for this guy. Wyald is one of the worst characters in Berserk, period, and his anatomy is a big part of the reason why. He knows that he's stronger than 99.9% of all people, and so he exploits that strength to do as he pleases, no matter the cost to others. It was only after encountering a human being on par with him as a fighter that Wyald lost his evil edge, and once he felt his life slipping away from him, he became as desperate as a child looking for its favorite toy, trying to survive that fate. But that's enough out of us. What do you guys think? Let us know in the comments down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.